When I turned 65, I threw a party for my family, and no one came. I stood in my dining room at exactly 6:42 p.m., staring at the 8 place settings I had arranged with my best china, the same white plates with the thin gold rim that I only brought out for Christmas and graduations, and I realized that the silence in my house was louder than any argument we had ever had. I had spent 3 weeks planning that evening, 3 weeks choosing recipes Elliot loved as a boy: slow roasted beef with rosemary, buttery mashed potatoes, green beans with toasted almonds, and the chocolate layer cake with homemade frosting that Meadow once called almost as good as a bakery, and I remembered smiling at that compliment because I thought it meant I was still needed. The candles I lit at 6 o'clock had already burned halfway down by the time I checked my phone for the 4th time. No missed calls, no text messages, no running late, Mom. Just the quiet glow of a blank screen, reflecting back a woman who suddenly looked older than 65. I told myself there must be traffic on the interstate, maybe an accident, maybe a last-minute errand for the kids. But deep down, a slow, steady ache began to spread across my chest. Not sharp, not dramatic, just heavy. At 7:15, I called Elliot. It went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't want to sound desperate. I set the phone back down on the kitchen counter and adjusted the napkin at Meadow's seat, smoothing it as if she might walk in at any second and notice whether it was folded properly. By 8 o'clock, the roast had gone dry in the oven, and the cake sat untouched on its glass stand, the candles unlit now because I couldn't bring myself to relight them for an empty room. I turned off the oven, moved slowly around the table, and began clearing plates that had never been used, each one making a soft clink as I stacked it, that small sound echoing through the house like proof that I had imagined the whole evening.
It wasn't until I sat down in my living room chair, the same armchair my late husband used to read the Sunday paper in, that I made the mistake of opening Facebook. There it was at the top of my feed, Meadow's smiling face against a blue sky so bright it almost hurt to look at. Elliot beside her, sunglasses on, his arm around our grandchildren. Behind them, the wide sweep of the ocean. The caption read, "Family cruise getaway. So grateful for this beautiful time together." The timestamp said it had been posted an hour ago. An hour ago, while I was checking the driveway for headlights that were never coming. I stared at that photo for a long time, taking in every detail. The way Meadow tilted her head slightly toward Elliot, the way the kids leaned into her, the way my son looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. I didn't cry. That surprised me the most. I had always thought that if my family ever truly forgot me, I would break apart right there on the spot. Instead, I felt something else, something colder. I set my phone down carefully on the coffee table and folded my hands in my lap. 65 years old. A lifetime of birthdays spent baking cakes for others, hosting dinners, remembering anniversaries, sending cards. And on the first birthday I ever threw for myself, I had been erased. Not forgotten, not overlooked, erased. I looked around my quiet living room, at the framed photos on the mantel, at Elliot's high school graduation picture, at the family portrait from 5 years ago where Meadow stood slightly in front of me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if this night had not been an accident at all, but the final step in something that had been happening slowly, quietly, for years.
The house felt different the next morning. Not dramatic, not shattered, just rearranged in a way that made everything slightly unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves had shifted a few inches while I slept. I woke up at 6, out of habit, the way I always had when Elliot was a boy and needed breakfast before school, and for a moment I forgot what had happened. I lay there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a delivery truck on Maple Street, expecting to hear my phone buzz with an apology that would explain everything. It did not. I got up, slipped on my robe, and walked into the kitchen, where the cake still sat under its glass dome. The frosting had hardened overnight, the candles still tucked neatly in the drawer where I had placed them back without lighting them. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter, staring at the 8 chairs around the table, each one pushed in perfectly, untouched. I did not rush to clean up. Instead, I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I were preserving evidence of something I was only beginning to understand. I opened the refrigerator and wrapped the leftover roast in foil, even though no one had taken a single bite. I placed the mashed potatoes into a plastic container and labeled it with the date, a habit from years of keeping an organized home. The act felt almost absurd, as if I were pretending there would be someone to eat them later. Around 9 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed. My heart lifted in spite of myself. It was a text from Elliot. "Sorry, Mom, we meant to tell you sooner. Meadow booked the cruise months ago. It was a surprise. We will celebrate when we get back." I read the message twice. We meant to tell you sooner. Not, we forgot. Not, I am sorry we missed your birthday. We meant to tell you sooner. The difference mattered. I set the phone down and walked into the living room, where the morning light fell across the family photographs on the mantel. I studied them carefully. There was the picture from Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when Meadow insisted on hosting at her house because she said my place was too small for everyone, even though I had fit 12 people comfortably for decades. There was the photograph from Emma's kindergarten graduation, where I stood at the far end of the row, slightly cut off at the edge of the frame. At the time, I told myself it was just positioning, just bad timing. Now I wondered how many times I had quietly stepped aside without realizing I was being moved.
I picked up the frame from Elliot's 30th birthday party. Meadow had organized that one as well. I remembered arriving with a homemade pie, only to find that she had ordered a custom cake from an expensive bakery, complete with a large display table that left no room for my dessert. She had laughed and said, "Oh, Loretta, you did not have to bring anything." I had smiled and placed my pie in the kitchen, untouched by the end of the night. Standing there in the quiet, I began to see a pattern. Not loud, not cruel on the surface, but consistent. Invitations delivered late. Plans changed without notice. Decisions made without my input. And always, the explanation that it was simpler this way. I carried the stack of unused plates back to the cabinet and slid them into place one by one. The sound of porcelain meeting wood felt steady, grounding. I was not confused. I was not forgetful. I was not overly sensitive. I had been repositioned, slowly and politely, until I no longer stood at the center of my own family. I washed the last of the glasses and dried my hands carefully on a clean towel. Outside, the sun was bright. Neighbors mowing their lawns, children riding bicycles up and down the sidewalk. Life went on exactly as it always had. But something inside me had shifted. I was no longer waiting for headlights in the driveway. I was no longer refreshing my phone. I was beginning to understand that the silence I felt was not an accident. It was a message, delivered without raised voices, without confrontation, but clear all the same. And for the first time, instead of asking what I had done wrong, I asked a different question entirely. Who had decided I no longer belonged?
That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed and took out the photo albums I had not looked at since my husband passed away. I carried them one by one to the dining table that had been set for 8 the night before and sat down in Elliot's empty chair. The first album smelled faintly of dust and lavender sachets. Inside were glossy prints from a time when Elliot still held my hand in public without embarrassment, when he would run into the kitchen after school and ask what was for dinner before dropping his backpack on the floor. I turned the pages slowly. There he was at 5 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth. There he was at 10, standing proudly beside the small vegetable garden we planted together in the backyard. There he was at 18, hugging me tightly after his high school graduation ceremony, telling me he would never forget everything I had done for him. I traced the edge of that photograph with my finger and tried to reconcile that boy with the man who had sent a 3-line text message instead of showing up at my door. It was not sudden. That is what I kept realizing. The distance had not arrived overnight. It had crept in politely. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after Elliot married Meadow. She suggested hosting at their townhouse because she wanted to start their own traditions. I agreed immediately. I even arrived early to help. When I walked in carrying 2 casseroles, Meadow smiled and said the oven was already full, but that I could set my dishes on the side table. They were never opened. I told myself it was an adjustment period. New marriage, new routines. I remembered the summer barbecue when Meadow created a group message to plan the event and somehow forgot to include me until the day before. She apologized lightly, saying technology could be confusing. I laughed it off, even though I had used the same smartphone for years without trouble. There was the Christmas when Elliot said they were keeping things simple and intimate, just the four of them. Later, I saw photographs online of a living room filled with neighbors and coworkers. I had not been angry. I had been embarrassed that I had believed the explanation so easily. Sitting there with the album open in front of me, I began to understand that each small moment had been a quiet rehearsal for the night of my birthday, a gradual repositioning, a subtle redrawing of boundaries in which I was moved from the center to the edge.
I closed the album and leaned back in the chair. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock above the stove. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Had Elliot noticed? Or had he simply chosen the path of least resistance? It is easier to nod along than to challenge the person you share a home with. It is easier to say nothing than to risk tension at the dinner table. I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair pulled neatly into a low bun and fine lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of smiling at school plays and birthday candles. She did not look fragile. She did not look confused. She looked thoughtful. I pressed my palm lightly against the cool glass of the mirror and allowed the truth to settle. This was not about a cruise. It was not about a scheduling mistake. It was about a role that had been rewritten without my consent. And if I had been quietly edited out of family gatherings, then I needed to decide whether I would continue accepting the footnotes or finally step back into the main story of my own life.
The following week passed with a strange calm that felt almost rehearsed. I went through my usual routines as if nothing had shifted, watering the small row of hydrangeas along the fence, folding laundry with steady hands, driving to the grocery store on Tuesday morning at 9:30 like I always did. From the outside, my life looked unchanged, but inside, something had sharpened. I was no longer drifting through memories trying to make sense of them. I was observing. On Thursday afternoon, Meadow posted another set of photographs from the cruise. This time it was a sunset dinner on the deck, the sky streaked in pink and gold. Elliot was laughing at something one of the children had said. Meadow had tagged the location and added a caption about making unforgettable memories. I studied the image carefully. It was not the happiness that unsettled me. It was the ease, the way they seemed entirely unburdened. I wondered whether my absence had created more space at their table than my presence ever had. Later that evening, Emma called me from Elliot's phone. Her voice was bright and breathless. She told me about the pool on the ship and the ice cream bar that was open all day. Then, in the casual way children reveal truths adults try to soften, she said, "Mommy said you do not really like traveling anymore, Grandma, so this would have been boring for you." I paused before answering. I have never said I dislike traveling. I drove 800 miles with my husband one summer just to see the mountains in Colorado. I flew across the country when Emma was born because I did not want to miss her first week home. But I did not correct her. I simply said I was glad she was having fun. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and replayed her words. "You do not really like traveling anymore." It was a small sentence, harmless on the surface, yet it carried weight. It suggested a version of me that had been quietly rewritten in conversations I was not part of. A woman who preferred staying home, a woman who might decline invitations, a woman whose absence was practical, even considerate. I opened the drawer where I kept old greeting cards and found one Meadow had given me 2 years ago. It thanked me for always being supportive and understanding. I remembered how proud I felt reading that word, understanding. I had worn it like a badge of honor. Now I began to see how convenient that quality had been for everyone else. It meant I did not ask difficult questions. It meant I accepted last-minute changes. It meant I smiled when plans shifted without warning. I walked into my home office and sat down at the desk my husband built for me when he retired. The wood was smooth beneath my fingertips. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Family. Inside were copies of financial documents, life insurance policies, and the trust we had set up years ago to ensure Elliot and the children would be secure one day. I had not reviewed those papers in a long time. I had trusted that love and loyalty would outlast paperwork. As I flipped through the pages, I felt something steady settle inside me. I was not powerless. I was not dependent. I had built this life carefully, brick by brick, decision by decision. The house was in my name. The savings were mine to allocate. The future was not something that had already been decided for me. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, but this time I did not push it to the back. I placed it at the front, within easy reach. Then I stood at the window and looked out at the quiet street. For years I had believed that keeping the peace meant staying silent. Now I was beginning to understand that silence can also be mistaken for surrender, and I had no intention of surrendering the place I had earned in my own family.
They returned on a Sunday afternoon, their SUV pulling into the driveway across town while I was trimming the edges of my front lawn. I knew because Meadow posted a photograph the moment they arrived home, suitcases lined up by the door, a caption about being exhausted but happy. I did not comment. I did not press the small red heart. Instead, I finished trimming the grass, coiled the hose neatly against the brick wall, and went inside to wash my hands. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Elliot. His voice sounded cheerful, almost cautious. He said they were back and asked if I wanted to come over for dinner that evening so the children could give me a small souvenir from the trip. I listened carefully to the tone beneath his words. There was no mention of my birthday, no acknowledgement of the empty chairs, just an invitation, as if we were resuming a conversation that had never been interrupted. I told him I already had plans, but that they were welcome to stop by my house instead. There was a brief pause on the line before he agreed. At 6:30, their car pulled into my driveway. I watched through the living room window as the children ran ahead, their sneakers slapping against the concrete, their laughter bright and unguarded. Emma burst through the front door and wrapped her arms around my waist. I hugged her back tightly, breathing in the faint scent of sunscreen and hotel soap. Elliot followed, carrying a small gift bag with tissue paper peeking out from the top. Meadow stepped in last, smiling politely, her posture relaxed, as if she were entering a neighbor's home rather than the house that had once hosted every holiday they now claimed as their own. We sat around my dining table, this time set for 4. I had prepared a simple meal, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Nothing elaborate, nothing ceremonial. During dinner, the children talked about water slides and buffet breakfasts. Elliot described the size of the ship in careful detail, explaining how it had 15 decks and a theater larger than any auditorium in our town. Meadow nodded along, occasionally adding a detail about the spa or the view from their balcony. I listened without interruption. At one point, Emma looked up at me and said, "Grandma, Mommy said you were busy on your birthday anyway." The room grew slightly quieter. Meadow reached for her water glass and took a sip before responding in a light voice that she had not meant it that way, that schedules had simply been complicated. I met her eyes across the table. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply held her gaze a moment longer than usual, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to be noticed. After dinner, Elliot handed me the gift bag. Inside was a refrigerator magnet shaped like a cruise ship and a keychain with a name with the island they had visited. I thanked him sincerely. Then I stood up, walked to the hallway cabinet, and retrieved the cedar box where I kept important documents. I carried it back to the table and set it down gently. The children were distracted by the television in the living room. Meadow watched me carefully now. I opened the box and removed a single folder, placing it in front of me but not yet opening it. I looked at Elliot first. I told him I had spent the past week reviewing my finances and organizing my estate plans, something I should have done long ago. I explained calmly that I would be making a few adjustments, nothing dramatic, simply ensuring that my intentions were clear moving forward. Meadow's smile faltered for the briefest second. Elliot shifted in his chair, confusion flickering across his face. I did not accuse. I did not list grievances. I spoke the way I always had, measured and steady. But this time, there was no apology in my tone. I had finally understood that being understanding did not require being silent, and that clarity, once spoken aloud, could change the temperature of a room without anyone raising their voice. After they left that night, the house did not feel empty the way it had on my birthday. It felt alert. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, my hand resting on the back of the chair where Meadow had been sitting, replaying every expression that had crossed her face when I mentioned my estate plans. It had only been a flicker, a tightening around her eyes, a slight pause before she reached for her purse, but it was there. Elliot had looked confused, almost wounded, as if the idea that I might make independent decisions had never occurred to him. I cleaned the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands while I considered what I needed to do next. The following morning, I woke up before sunrise and dressed carefully in a navy blazer and slacks I used to wear to parent-teacher conferences and community meetings.
I drove 15 minutes across town to the office of the attorney who had helped my husband and me draft our original trust. The brass plaque on the door still read, William Carter, Attorney at Law. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. When I sat down across from Mr. Carter, he greeted me warmly and asked how the family was doing. I answered honestly. I told him they were well. Then I slid the folder across his desk. I explained that I wanted to update my documents, to clarify certain distributions, and to ensure that specific assets would be placed in separate trusts for Emma and her brother, with clear conditions about access and management. I spoke calmly, without bitterness. This was not about revenge, it was about structure. It was about removing ambiguity. Mr. Carter listened carefully, occasionally nodding as he made notes. He reminded me that the house was solely in my name and that the investment accounts were under my control. He explained the process for revising beneficiaries and setting up safeguards so that funds would go directly to the children at appropriate ages, not through intermediary accounts. I felt a steady sense of grounding as he spoke. For years, I had allowed myself to believe that love alone would keep everything aligned. Now I understood that clarity was a form of protection. By noon, I had signed preliminary documents authorizing the revisions. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just ink on paper and a plan set in motion. When I stepped back outside into the bright afternoon sun, I felt lighter, not because I had taken something away from my son, but because I had reclaimed responsibility for my own choices.
That evening, Elliot called again. His voice carried a hint of unease. He asked what I had meant the night before about adjustments. I told him simply that as I grow older, I believe in putting things in order. I explained that I wanted the grandchildren's future secured directly and transparently. There was a long pause on the line. He said he trusted me. I thanked him for saying that. Meadow did not get on the phone. I imagined her listening nearby, calculating the implications. I did not accuse her of anything. I did not reference the cruise or the birthday. I did not need to. The shift had already begun. Over the next few days, I organized more than paperwork. I sorted through closets, donated clothes I no longer wore, rearranged the living room to let in more light. Each small action felt symbolic, a clearing of space. I was not preparing to leave my life behind. I was reinforcing it. On Thursday afternoon, I received an email confirmation from the attorney outlining the next steps. I printed it and placed it neatly in the front of the cedar box. Then I closed the lid and set it back in the hallway cabinet. Not hidden, not buried, but present. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like a guest waiting for an invitation. I felt like the owner of my own story, and the difference between those two roles was greater than any cruise ship deck or ocean horizon.
The change did not explode into the open the way dramatic confrontations do. It unfolded quietly, almost politely. A few days after my meeting with the attorney, Meadow called me directly for the first time in months. Her voice was warm, almost syrupy, the way it used to be when she first joined our family. She asked how I was feeling and whether I needed help with anything around the house. The offer sounded generous on the surface, but I heard the question beneath it. I told her I was doing well and that I had recently reviewed my long-term plans to make sure everything was organized. There was a pause, just long enough for me to picture her recalculating. She said that she and Elliot had been talking about how much maintenance a house can require as someone gets older. She mentioned that their neighborhood had a beautiful community with smaller homes and walking paths, a place that might be easier for me in the future. I thanked her for the suggestion. I told her I appreciated her concern. Then I added that I had no intention of moving. The house was fully paid off. The stairs did not trouble me. The yard was manageable. Silence settled between us for a moment. It was not hostile. It was measured. That evening, Elliot called as well. He spoke more cautiously this time, asking whether I had considered simplifying my assets to avoid complications later. I recognized the language. It was the same phrasing Mr. Carter had used in a neutral context, but in Elliot's voice, it sounded like a borrowed script. I answered calmly. I told him I had simplified everything already, that the documents were clear, that the grandchildren's interests were secured directly. He asked what I meant by directly. I explained without hesitation that I had created separate trusts for Emma and her brother that could not be redirected, adjusted, or managed by anyone other than a neutral fiduciary until they reached the age specified in the documents. He was quiet for several seconds. When he finally spoke,
He said he hoped I did not think he would ever misuse anything intended for his children. I told him it was not about mistrust, it was about clarity. Love does not replace structure. Structure protects love.
The next Sunday, they invited me over again. I accepted. Their dining room looked immaculate, newly rearranged. Meadow had placed fresh flowers in the center of the table and greeted me with a hug that lingered slightly longer than usual. During dinner, Elliot mentioned casually that they were exploring options for a larger home in a different school district. Meadow added that real estate prices were rising quickly and that timing could make a significant financial difference. I listened carefully. Then I asked whether they had already spoken to a lender. Meadow blinked, surprised by the specificity of my question. Elliot admitted they had been pre-approved. I nodded and said that planning ahead was wise. Then I added, in the same steady tone I had used in the attorney's office, that I would not be co-signing any loans, refinancing my property, or leveraging my accounts for additional purchases. The words were simple, clear, final. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of anything. But the temperature of the room shifted. Meadow's fork rested against her plate, untouched. Elliot looked down at the tablecloth as if reading an invisible pattern. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. I was not rejecting them. I was defining the boundaries that had once been assumed but never stated. After dessert, I stood and gathered my purse. Meadow walked me to the door. Her smile was thinner now, less confident. She said they only wanted what was best for everyone. I agreed, and for the first time in years, I believed that what was best for everyone included me.
The following week unfolded with a careful balance that felt almost ceremonial. No one mentioned loans again. No one suggested communities with walking paths or smaller staircases. Instead, Meadow began sending polite text messages, asking whether I would like to join them for Sunday brunch or attend Emma's piano recital the following month. The invitations arrived earlier than usual, complete with dates and times clearly stated. I noticed the change, but I did not comment on it. I accepted some invitations and declined others, not out of spite, but out of choice. For years, I had rearranged my schedule at the slightest hint of inclusion, afraid that hesitation might cost me access. Now I allowed myself the dignity of deciding. On Wednesday morning, I met Mr. Carter again to finalize the revisions to my estate documents. We reviewed each clause carefully. The house would remain mine unless I chose otherwise. The investment accounts would flow into structured trusts with independent oversight and scheduled distributions tied to age and educational milestones. I added one more provision, small but deliberate. Any future gifts exceeding a certain amount would require written acknowledgement and be documented formally, not because I expected conflict, but because clarity leaves less room for assumption. When I signed the final pages, the pen felt steady in my hand. That afternoon, I invited Elliot and Meadow to my home for dinner the following Saturday. I prepared a simple meal again, nothing elaborate, but I set the table with quiet precision. 4 plates, 4 glasses, no empty chairs waiting for someone who might not arrive. They came on time. Elliot carried a bottle of sparkling water. Meadow brought a salad in a glass bowl, arranged carefully, almost performative in its generosity. During dinner, the conversation remained light. School schedules, work updates, neighborhood news. After the plates were cleared, I rose from my chair and walked to the hallway cabinet. I returned with the cedar box and placed it gently at the center of the table. Elliot's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Meadow's fingers tightened around her napkin. I opened the lid and removed a single copy of the finalized trust summary. I did not hand it to them immediately. I explained calmly that everything was now organized and that I wanted them to understand how the future would unfold. I described the protections in place with the children, the age benchmarks, the independent management. I clarified that the house and accounts would not be leveraged, transferred, or co-signed under any circumstance without my direct and voluntary decision. I spoke slowly, not to intimidate, but to remove any remaining ambiguity. When I finished, I slid the summary across the table toward Elliot. He read silently. Meadow leaned slightly closer, scanning the pages. The room was quiet, except for the soft rustle of paper. Finally, Elliot looked up. His expression was not angry. It was thoughtful. He said he had not realized I felt the need to formalize things so thoroughly. I answered honestly. I told him that clarity protects relationships. It prevents misunderstandings from growing in silence. Meadow offered a careful smile and said it was wise to plan ahead. I held her gaze and nodded. I agreed. Planning ahead is wise. After a few more minutes of measured conversation, I closed the box and returned it to the cabinet. We said goodnight at the front door. The children waved from the car. As their tail lights disappeared down the street, I stood on my porch in the quiet evening air and felt something settle firmly into place. I had not shouted. I had not accused. I had not revisited the empty chairs or the cruise photographs. I had simply redrawn the lines of my own life in ink instead of assumption. And for the first time since that silent birthday evening, I did not feel erased. I felt defined. The weeks that followed did not feel dramatic, and that was the point. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no final speeches delivered across a dining table. Instead, there was a steady recalibration. Elliot began calling me once a week, not out of obligation, but with a tone that sounded more present, as if he were rediscovering how to speak to me without someone else finishing his sentences. Meadow remained polite, careful, her words measured. The invitations continued to arrive on time, details were included, assumptions were no longer made on my behalf. One afternoon, Emma asked if she could come over and bake cookies with me for a school fundraiser. Meadow dropped her off at 2 o'clock sharp. She stood in my doorway for a moment, glancing around the living room as if seeing it with new awareness. The house was tidy, sunlit, unchanged. She commented that it looked lovely. I thanked her. There was no tension in my voice, no hidden edge. Just truth. While Emma and I mixed flour and sugar at the kitchen counter, I watched her small hands concentrate on cracking eggs carefully into a bowl. She looked up at me and asked why grown-ups sometimes forget things that matter. I did not ask what she meant. I simply told her that sometimes people move too quickly and assume everyone understands their intentions. She nodded as if that answer satisfied her. Later, when Meadow returned to pick her up, she lingered longer than usual. She mentioned again that they were considering houses in another district, but that they had decided to wait. I did not ask why. I did not need to. Waiting can mean many things. It can mean caution. It can mean reconsideration. It can mean recognizing that certain foundations are not as easily accessed as once imagined. A month after my birthday, Elliot came by alone. He stood in the doorway holding a small box. Inside was a framed photograph from years ago, one I had not seen in a long time. It showed the 3 of us at the county fair, Elliot in his 20s, Meadow newly married into the family, all of us smiling under a string of carnival lights. He said he found it while cleaning out a drawer and thought I might want it. I took the frame and studied it quietly. We looked close in that picture, shoulders touching, eyes bright. I placed it on the mantel beside the other photographs, not in the center, not hidden in the corner, simply part of the collection. Elliot sat down at the kitchen table and told me he had not realized how much he had allowed others to manage the rhythm of our family. He did not blame Meadow. He did not blame me. He spoke in a way that sounded reflective, not defensive. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him that families do not fracture in a single moment. They shift gradually, and sometimes they need someone to notice the shift and speak plainly. I reminded him that I am 65, not fragile, not confused, not waiting for permission to exist. I am capable of joy. I am capable of boundaries. I am capable of walking away from any table where my chair has been quietly removed. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, the silence between us felt steady rather than strained. After he left, I stood in the doorway and watched the sun dip low over the rooftops. The street was calm, the air cool. I thought about the night I waited for headlights that never came. I thought about the ocean photograph and the empty chairs. None of it needed to be erased. It had served its purpose. It had shown me something I had been unwilling to see. I stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and turned off the porch light. I had not reclaimed attention. I had reclaimed authority, and there is a difference.